Good afternoon, everyone, and clearly thank you to Lita in particular, FW Foundation, for inviting me to speak to you. I am not a diplomat, so let me just warn you ahead of time. Never have been. And a lot of statements I make have often been found contentious, which is just fine. I think it's a great privilege to speak, particularly at this juncture, at a conference which looks both at the past, the present, and the future of South Africa. Maybe let me start by, and that's a little bit of a reference to the past, tell you how I met President de Klerk. Probably 2019, so it was almost the dawn of Ramaphosa's era and of Jacob Zuma's era, and it was a conference organized by PwC in London, a luncheon. And it was a luncheon with President de Klerk and the investment community in London. And as these things usually go, big round table, probably spanning the size of this room, probably around 20 portfolio managers, asset managers representing various asset management firms, all male, by the way. President de Klerk stood up and very valiantly tried to sell South Africa as an investment destination, which was absolutely amazing to hear and to see someone so passionate about a country. In response to which, he got an absolute barrage of abuse in terms of the corruption in South Africa and why should anyone from a global perspective look at South Africa and invest in South Africa. And it literally came from every side of the room. So I kind of looked at this and I thought, okay, he needs help. So I stood up and, not that anyone knew who I was, I stood up and I introduced myself by obviously just saying I'm Magda Wierzycka, but more importantly, I'm proudly South African. And I said, let's talk about corruption, shall we? In a state of corruption, there is always someone who pays and someone who accepts the bribe. So let's rather focus on people who paid. Shall we look at McKinsey? Shall we look at KPMG? Shall we look at SEP? Sorry. Shall we look at Deloitte? Shall we look at Bain? Those were the people who paid. Paying off people in a poor country like South Africa, where not a lot of people have, a lot of money, it's actually relatively easy. Bribing people who have nothing is not that difficult. So then I looked at everyone and I said, anyone here worked for McKinsey? Anyone here worked for KPMG? And of course, in asset management industry, that's usually the entry point into investments. So everyone just looked down at their plates and started eating. And that was that in terms of talking about corruption. But we continue to live with corruption in South Africa, as we all know. And unfortunately, we remain very vulnerable to it. McKinsey, for all of the distraction of Eskom and the havoc they wreaked on the lives of millions of South Africans, paid $120 million in fines. So, it's like a rounding error in the financials. Absolutely nothing. Much has changed since that lunch. We have seen the demise of Jacob Zuma. And although we have seen him again with his gallery of rogues reappearing in Parliament and MK Party, they really are a shadow of their former self. And yes, they are a meaningful force in KwaZulu-Natal, but really not in terms of the broader stage of South Africa. EFF, by and large, through MK Party, has become an irrelevant voice. I mean, they really are struggling for meaning and for a message, particularly with losses of half their leadership. I wonder how much was paid for that. We have Cyril Ramaphosa as president, and I think everyone will agree, he is not what we expected. We expected more. At the time he was elected, and certainly I was very involved at that stage, particularly in trying to fundraise for his elections. Someone said to me, who knows him well at the time, that he is non-strategic and indecisive. Those were the two words, and those two words kind of stuck with me in watching what has transpired subsequently. However, we do have something to thank him for. And I think, that's not necessarily said, that openly. And that is, we can thank him for bringing the dawn of new democracy to South Africa. For the first time in 30 years, we are back to a democratic society. We are not under control of a singular party and a singular ideology and a singular point of view. We are back to a democracy where different voices are heard and can be heard. And that can only be good. So thank you, sir. So we do now have the Government National Unity, GNU. And I think the best thing about it is that it had brought accountability back to the table. Different points of view, but accountability. People are now held to account. It is not so easy to just say, it's my way or no way, as ANC has gotten used to saying. I know that there is a lot of kind of political banter in the press. There was a lot of noise about the Expropriation Act, about the NHI bill. But, just looking at the Expropriation Act, it really was not irrelevant piece of legislation, but it really was something that, just codified and introduced into a process a law that has already been there for years. So really what we're talking about is, political parties making a stand in the press rather than the meaning of the actual piece of legislation. The NHI bill, more problematic, but it will take years to get through courts, and there's, of course, no money for any of it. So, how relevant is something that you can't afford? But it makes for great headlines. From what I know in terms of how Cabinet operates right now, it's amazing how apparently it's just business as normal. So what you see in the press versus what's happening behind the scenes, everyone is working together in recognition of you have to, in order for South Africa not to become a failed state. In terms of business, so I'm supposed to represent more of a corporate voice. I think that domestic business confidence has never been higher. Certainly not, I've been in the asset management industry for 30 years. The only time, and I was maybe too young to even recognize that, the only time I have seen that level of business confidence was in the 1990s, in that kind of golden era. We also have, maybe not surprisingly, but the most business-oriented climate than ever before. There's a lot more that you are hearing and a lot more recognition from government that, private-public partnerships towards absolutely anything, particularly in the infrastructure space or clean energy space, are essential. And there is now willingness from government to engage, and hopefully with more representation around the table in government, there will be more concrete implementation of projects, particularly infrastructure projects, than ever before. Now the question is, positivity is great, but where do we go from here in terms of, kind of tangibility of it? And 1994, post-1994, we lived through a completely golden decade of investment and excitement about South Africa, and as South Africa was in the spotlight, we even had a budget surplus under Trevor Manuel. But, how do you get back to that kind of era? How do you, incentivize or bring interest to South Africa again? And to be perfectly honest, it's hell of a challenge, and it will take a heck of a lot. So maybe, talking about Africa, I do look at Africa, and, I have spoken at international conferences, but to me, Africa is a bit of a forgotten continent. And that is despite the fact that it is the home to 30% of world's mineral reserves, 40% of gold, 90% of platinum. It has the fastest growing population in the world. However, it's also a continent that will be disproportionately, already is, disproportionately affected by climate change. If Trump thinks he's got a problem, or Europe thinks they've got a problem with refugees right now, political refugees, wait for climate refugees. It's estimated that by 2050 there will be 1.2 billion people heading north escaping climate change in Africa. ESCOM, we are all, celebrating the fact that there's end of load shedding. Well, you know how end of load shedding came about. They restarted all the coal power stations that were being mothballed. Based on ESCOM's own predictions, by 2050, most of the farmland in Western Cape on the back of that will be gone. A lot of Western Cape will become a desert. And then, again, I know I'm being kind of very negative. I will come to some positivity just now. And, the other thing about Africa, and I think, we're all watching the emergence of AI and robotics, new technology. Africa is completely left behind in that space. We know it, absolutely know it. We're not even talking about it. And then, another footnote, it was BRICS, but I attended a conference, I was speaking at a conference in Miami, actually organized by the Saudis, perversely, but I sat in the audience and there was a panel of, again, international asset managers representing some of the largest asset management firms in the world, in the United States. And they started talking about, they were talking about US, they always only talk about the US, but eventually someone said, we should actually talk about the BRICS. Should we not put BRICS on the table? And, someone started talking about the BRICS. And as he was talking, he started listing, Brazil, Russia, India, China. So the BRICS are very relevant. And suddenly I realized that he thinks of S as a plural letter. He doesn't think of it as a country. And everyone carried on, as if nothing has happened. So how do you overcome the challenge? And also you've got to ask yourself a question of how relevant are we really? We are loud. The International Court of Justice certainly proved that. Rugby proves that as well. But are we relevant in terms of investments and investment destination? And you know what? It's really difficult to say. Foreign money is still flowing out of South Africa. Inflation is high. Our budget deficit is growing. We are on the FATFA's grey list, which is not to be underestimated. It's kind of like a bunch of crooks, which we have to get out of. And then we have problems that we're all aware of and problems that will not be resolved in our lifetime. And that's your unemployment, lack of education, the general poverty that surrounds us. And then we are playing against the background of a polarized world where, as we know, alliances, partnerships are in the spotlight. But more importantly, we are moving into a very, very transactional world. Trump, in particular, is all about deals, the art of a deal. Now, from a business perspective, business understands transactions and business understands deal-making, the way that politicians do not. So when we look at the world from a business perspective, we see a very different world. And, in deal-making, optics matter. And here, kind of photo ops with Putin are perhaps not the best way to strike a deal. And that is particularly against the backdrop of our largest trading partners are the US and the EU. Look how easily US can destabilize South Africa, pull HIV, AIDS, and TB funding, like this. $400 million stopped. 13,000 people facing unemployment. And we have one of the world's best HIV/AIDS prevention and treatment programs in the world. One man in the United States can turn off the lights. And here we are, photo ops with Putin. I wanted to say, well, why don't you phone Putin, see how much money he gives us? So I'll tell you something, it's not coming. So in a world of that, where things which affect millions of people can be derailed by one man on the back of what he thinks of South Africa, or Africa, I think we know what he thinks of Africa, you can't really be standing back and, thinking that it's business as normal. US will just, the money will just flow. Biden was a benign man at the end of the day. And then, the thing that one does need to worry about is the extent to which AI is leaving Africa behind, South Africa behind. There's no conversation in South Africa being held, not in any business circles that I'm aware of, about AI and the impact of that. And I attend these kind of CEO forums in the US periodically, and the only conversation on the table is what is the corporate world doing in terms of adoption of AI. And I know that possibly not many of you in the room necessarily use ChatGPT, and you don't have to, but the latest news about a very lightweight version of ChatGPT, which was released by the Chinese a couple of days ago, made global news. It's a very lightweight model, but it can already answer the question of how do we make a bomb. Doesn't necessarily answer and give you the details of a nuclear bomb, but there is already, and multiple, by the way, not just DeepSpeak, multiple large language models now in the world of AI which can actually tell you how to make bombs. And there is no filter mechanism over that whatsoever. So being left behind, let's look at what do we bring to the table. Well, one thing that, again, transactional and commercial, South Africa controls 70% of the world's manganese and 80% of the world's platinum. Now, platinum, as many of you know, are the key input, or is the key input into car batteries. And given that clean energy has now taken a backstage, which it has, by the way, all of a sudden, that becomes more relevant than it might have become. For US, despite all this HIV/AIDS pooling of programs, US imports 100% of its chromium from South Africa, 25% manganese, titanium, and platinum from South Africa. So we're not completely irrelevant in the lives of United States. Parts of Southern Africa, I'll say parts carefully, still look to South Africa for leadership, perhaps. Having said that, we are the largest per capita economy in Africa. We are perceived, with new government coming in, as being more stable than we have been for years. And some rating agencies actually expect to re-rate us in the near future, what obviously would be great for attracting investments. A positive one is, I split my time between UK, US, and South Africa, kind of half-half. UK has just changed all of the tax laws, and speaking to our tax lawyers, I kind of went, well, what's the point of staying in the grim country that is UK? I'm here from UK. Why don't I just come back full-time to South Africa? And there was a host of reasons. I mean, basically, they just said to me, you can't do it right now. There's a queue of people ahead of you. Well, there's a queue of very wealthy South Africans coming back. Apparently, everyone is migrating back. And not only South Africans coming back, wealthy people registering for tax in South Africa, because South Africa has a very benign tax regime. Surprisingly. Huge efforts are being made to remove South Africa off the grey list. And we are actually seeing some, but not enough, white-collar prosecutions, which is one of the things that FATFA looks at in terms of judging the country's kind of, credit or risk rating. Now, but the reality of it is right now, transactional world, what matters is which side do we choose to play for, and which side do we deal with. We have to choose. I know that there is a great political, very diplomatic language which talks to kind of the middle road, not taking sides. Well, unfortunately, I don't think the world is there. I think we're in a polarized world where you do get to choose and have to choose a side. Now, what are the consequences? Look, we can choose the East, we can choose the West. If we choose the East, theoretically, China and India provide massive consumer bases for exports. We could diversify our trading partners away from EU and away from US, potentially unlock infrastructure investment into Africa, although what China has experienced in terms of investing in Africa is not exactly, a winning formula. We would maintain the BRICS status for what it's worth, and really, I still have to see BRICS doing something, with the new development bank being, nothing that one can speak about. Of course, choosing the East, we risk becoming a victim of Trump's policies. In fact, I think we can guarantee that. Trade imbalances, again, if we choose the East, can we really compete on price? We're just going to face more Chinese imports coming in, with no tariffs being applied. And of course, the risk of any dependence on debt and debt dependence. And then there is, almost over, I know that you are waiting for the highlight of today. And then choosing the West, obviously we have then continued access to EU and US markets where we already have well-established trading treaties. You can guarantee a much faster progress in technology, adoption of technology. More Western investment coming in usually brings in technology, doesn't steal technology. We are more familiar in terms of culturally familiar with doing business with the West rather than with the East. And, the West, for all of its problems at the moment, it's an alliance with countries which still value democracy. And, I look at what we're going through now, and at the end of the day, 4 years here, 5 years there, do not make or break democracy. Democracy is the foundations of fairness and a fair system. Trump will come and Trump will go. It's 4 years of popcorn hour. He'll do things, people will criticize, he wants some headlines, and then he'll be gone. And someone else comes along. Democracy doesn't die. So if we want to align ourselves with the concept of democracy and live up to the constitution that we have, then, I wouldn't exactly be leaning towards the East. But, that's just me. Again, just talking to choosing the West, we would increase South Africa's standing on the global stage, re-ratings from rating agencies, and unlocking of capital investment. It's not going to happen if we go the East route. And domestic optimism, which, is very important. Being positive about South Africa, which doesn't mean that just because we align ourselves with the West, that we won't become victims of Trump's policies. We might. But there's a host of other reasons why that would be a more growth-oriented policy for South Africa to follow. Just that, growth. So that is really that. As I said, I don't think that bipartisan non-alignment approach, which is what's in the press continuously, is really that easy to achieve. I think we will have to choose. But on a positive side, and I'm really concluding now. Maybe it's a bit of a corny joke. At least we can now move forward and stop looking at South Africa through the eyes of the ANC and can look at the future through the eyes of GNU. And thank you very much.